Emma lived a simple, peaceful life in a quiet suburban neighborhood, tucked away at the edge of a forest. Her home wasn't fancy, but it was hers. A cozy little house with a backyard she had turned into her own private sanctuary. She grew vegetables, planted flowers, and even set up a small rainwater collection system to make sure she could take care of her plants, no matter what the weather threw her way. Emma loved being prepared. She always said, "You never know when Mother Nature is going to test you." The neighborhood itself was nice enough, though it came with its quirks. The Homeowners Association, or HOA as everyone called it, ruled the area with an iron fist. They had rules about everything: what color your front door could be, how tall your grass could grow, and even how often you watered your lawn. Most people followed the rules without complaint, but Emma found them irritating. Still, she kept her head down and stayed out of trouble. After all, her garden and her peace of mind were worth more than picking fights with the HOA. One summer, however, things took a turn for the worse. A drought swept through the region, drying up rivers, emptying reservoirs, and turning once green fields into dusty wastelands. It was the worst drought anyone could remember, and the HOA went into overdrive trying to enforce water restrictions. Signs popped up all over the neighborhood reminding residents to conserve water, and fines were handed out like candy for anyone caught wasting even a drop. Emma, who had spent years preparing for situations like this, felt confident she'd be okay. She had her rain barrels, her careful watering schedule, and her resourceful mindset. But then, one sweltering afternoon, everything changed. Emma came home from work exhausted, ready to relax after a long day. As soon as she walked inside, she noticed something odd. The sink was dry. No matter how hard she turned the faucet, not a single drop of water came out. Confused, she checked other taps in the house, but they were all the same. Panic started to creep in. How could this happen? Had there been a city-wide outage? Was her plumbing broken? It didn't take long for Emma to find out the truth. A neighbor mentioned seeing workers near her property earlier that day. When Emma went outside to investigate, she discovered a freshly dug trench along the edge of her yard, and her water line severed cleanly. Someone had deliberately cut off her water supply. Furious and confused, Emma marched straight to the HOA office to demand answers. The response she got was infuriatingly vague. Apparently, during routine maintenance, they decided her water line posed a potential risk to the neighborhood's infrastructure. Without giving her any warning, or even asking permission, they had simply cut it. For the greater good, they told her, as if that explained everything. Emma couldn't believe what she was hearing. Greater good? What about her good? She needed water just like everyone else, especially now, during a drought. That night, sitting alone in her dark kitchen, Emma stewed over what had happened. She felt powerless, betrayed, and angry, not just at the HOA, but at the unfairness of it all. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a spark of determination began to flicker. If the HOA thought they could push her around, they were wrong. Emma wasn't the kind of person to sit back and accept defeat. She would find a way to fight back, to survive, and maybe even teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget anytime soon. Little did they know, their decision to cut her water line was about to unleash a chain of events none of them could have predicted. The next morning, Emma woke up with a mix of emotions swirling inside her: anger at the HOA for their high-handedness, frustration over her situation, but also a growing sense of determination. She wasn't going to let this defeat her. If anything, it only made her more resolved to take control of her own life and find a solution. Sitting on her porch with a cup of tea, she brewed using bottled water. She stared out at her backyard. Her eyes landed on the narrow creek that wound its way through the woods behind her property. The creek had always been there, a quiet presence that most people in the neighborhood ignored. It wasn't large or impressive, just a trickle of water that flowed steadily year-round, even during dry spells. For years, Emma had admired it from afar, occasionally dipping her fingers into its cool current when she needed a moment of calm. But now, as she looked at it, something clicked in her mind. That creek wasn't just a pretty feature, it was a lifeline. And if the HOA had taken away her access to running water, maybe she could redirect nature's gift instead. Emma spent the rest of the day sketching ideas and gathering materials. She didn't have much to work with, just some old tarps, scraps of wood, a few shovels, and whatever else she could scavenge from around the house. But she didn't need much. What she lacked in tools, she made up for in creativity and grit. By evening, she had a rough plan. She would dig trenches and build makeshift channels to divert part of the creek toward her garden and rain barrels. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't happen overnight, but it was possible. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The first step was clearing a path near the edge of the creek where she planned to start digging. Her hands were blistered within minutes, and sweat dripped down her face, despite the cool night air. Still, she kept going, driven by a mixture of desperation and excitement. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving a point. The HOA thought they could crush her spirit. Fine. Let them watch what happened when someone decided to fight back, not with words or lawsuits, but with action. By midnight, Emma had dug a shallow trench about 10 feet long. It wasn't much, but it gave her hope. As she stood there, leaning on her shovel and catching her breath, she noticed how peaceful the world felt under the cover of darkness. The stars twinkled above, and the sound of the creek provided a soothing backdrop to her hard work. For the first time since the HOA cut her water line, she felt a glimmer of optimism. Maybe this crazy idea would actually work. Over the next few days, Emma continued working on her project whenever she had free time. During the day, she acted like nothing unusual was happening, chatting with neighbors and keeping up appearances. But every night, under the cloak of darkness, she returned to the creek, slowly reshaping its course one scoop of dirt at a time. She used rocks to reinforce the sides of her channel and lined it with tarps to prevent leaks. Each small success filled her with pride. She imagined the look on Mr. Grayson's face, the head of the HOA, when he realized she'd found a way to thrive without their precious rules. Of course, Emma knew she was walking a fine line. Altering the flow of a natural water source might raise eyebrows if anyone found out. So she worked carefully, covering her progress with fallen branches and brush to keep it hidden. Still, the thrill of doing something bold and slightly rebellious kept her going. Every swing of the shovel felt like a declaration of independence. The HOA may have tried to break her, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. They had underestimated Emma, and soon enough, they'd learn exactly why that was a mistake. As the days turned into weeks, Emma's secret project became her entire world. Every night, after the neighborhood grew quiet and the streets emptied, she slipped out into the darkness with her tools in hand. The creek was slowly beginning to change its course, inch by inch, thanks to her relentless effort. Each night brought new challenges, roots that refused to budge, rocks too heavy to lift alone, or unexpected rainstorms that flooded her trenches. But Emma tackled them all with a stubborn determination. She didn't have time to feel tired. Every second counted. To keep her work hidden, Emma got creative. She used piles of leaves and branches to disguise the freshly dug earth along the edges of her property. An old camouflage net she'd found in her garage helped mask the area from curious eyes. Even the sound of her shovel hitting the ground seemed louder than usual at night, so she worked as quietly as possible, pausing whenever a car drove by or a dog barked in the distance. Her heart raced every time she heard footsteps nearby. But so far, no one had caught her. It was like playing a game of hide and seek with the entire neighborhood. And Emma was winning. The physical toll of the work was undeniable. Her hands were raw and blistered, her back ached from hours of bending over, and her clothes were perpetually streaked with mud. But none of that mattered. In fact, the harder it got, the more satisfying it felt. Every rock she moved, every trench she dug, was a step closer to reclaiming her independence. And there was something almost poetic about using nature itself to fight back against the people who would try to control her. The creek wasn't just water, it was freedom flowing right through her fingertips. One evening, as Emma stood knee-deep in the chilly current, adjusting a tarp to guide the water into her newly constructed channel, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. This wasn't just about getting revenge on the HOA anymore. It was bigger than that. By rerouting the creek, she was proving that survival didn't have to mean relying on others or following their rules. If anything, this experience was teaching her how resourceful she could be when pushed to her limits. Still, Emma knew she couldn't afford to get complacent. The closer she came to completing her project, the greater the risk of being discovered. Neighbors might start noticing changes in the creek's flow or wonder why her yard remained green while theirs turned brown. To throw them off, she planted extra flowers near the edge of her property, hoping the burst of color would distract anyone who happened to glance her way. She also made a point of chatting casually with her neighbors during the day, asking about their struggles with the drought and sympathizing with their frustrations. "It's so unfair," she'd say with a shrug, pretending to share their helplessness. Inside, though, she was smiling. Despite the secrecy, there were moments when Emma couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. Late at night, as she watched the water trickle obediently into her channels, she imagined the look on Mr. Grayson's face if he ever figured out what she'd done. Would he be angry? Shocked? Impressed, even? No matter his reaction, one thing was certain. Emma wasn't going to let the HOA dictate her life anymore. They had underestimated her once, and they wouldn't get the chance to do it again. By the end of the third week, the transformation was undeniable. The creek now flowed smoothly toward her garden, filling her rain barrels and nourishing her plants. What had once been a dry patch of dirt was now a lush oasis, thriving despite the drought. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She hadn't just beaten the odds, she had rewritten them. And as she stood there, watching the water glisten under the moonlight, she realized something important. This wasn't just about surviving the drought. It was about showing everyone, including herself, that sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to create real change. It didn't take long for the subtle changes in the neighborhood to start drawing attention. At first, it was barely noticeable, a patch of grass here and there looking a little less green, a flower wilting slightly faster than usual. But as the weeks went by, the signs became impossible to ignore. The once pristine lawns that the HOA prided itself on were beginning to show the strain of the drought. Brown patches spread across yards like ink stains, and sprinklers worked overtime without making much of a difference. The groundwater levels, which had always been boosted by the gentle seepage from the creek, were now dwindling. Without that steady flow, the neighborhood's manicured landscapes were struggling to survive. Emma, meanwhile, watched all of this unfold with quiet satisfaction. Her garden, by contrast, was thriving. Her tomatoes were plump and red, her lettuce crisp and vibrant, and her flowers bloomed in brilliant colors that seemed almost defiant against the backdrop of the parched earth around her. Neighbors began to notice, their eyes narrowing as they compared her lush yard to their own failing attempts at maintaining perfection. Whispers started to ripple through the community. How was Emma managing to keep everything so green? Was she sneaking around the water restrictions? Did she have some kind of secret supply no one else knew about? At first, the gossip stayed vague. Nothing more than muttered comments over fences or sideways glances during morning walks. But eventually, curiosity turned into suspicion. One afternoon, as Emma watered her plants using water collected from her rain barrels, Mrs. Peterson from 2 doors down approached her. "You know," Mrs. Peterson said casually, though her tone hinted at something sharper beneath the surface, "most of us are really struggling to keep our yards alive. I don't know how you're doing it, Emma, but, well, we've all been wondering." Emma smiled sweetly, keeping her expression calm. "Oh, you know me," she replied with a shrug. "I just try to stay prepared. Rain barrels, Careful watering. Every little bit helps. She didn't mention the creek or her late-night project. Instead, she changed the subject, asking Mrs. Peterson how her roses were holding up. The conversation ended politely enough, but Emma could tell Mrs. Peterson wasn't convinced. Word would spread quickly after that, and Emma knew it. Sure enough, the whispers grew louder. Some neighbors accused her of tapping into restricted city water lines illegally. Others speculated that she must have a hidden well somewhere on her property. A few even suggested she was hoarding water before the drought hit. None of them guessed the truth, not yet. But the tension in the air was palpable. Every glance felt heavier, every casual comment laced with thinly veiled accusation. Despite the growing scrutiny, Emma refused to let it rattle her. If anything, she leaned into it. She started spending more time outside during the day, tending to her garden in plain sight. She chatted openly with anyone who stopped by, offering tips on conserving water and sharing stories about her rain barrel system. The more transparent she appeared, the less people suspected her of wrongdoing. After all, if she were hiding something, wouldn't she be acting guilty? But not everyone was fooled. Mr. Grayson, the head of the HOA, had been watching Emma closely. He'd always found her independent streak irritating, and now he couldn't shake the feeling that she was up to something. His suspicions deepened when he noticed faint tire tracks near the edge of her property one morning. Tracks that seemed to lead toward the woods where the creek ran. Something wasn't adding up, and he intended to find out what. For Emma, these developments only added fuel to her fire. She knew the risk of discovery was growing, but she also knew she was close to completing her project. The creek was flowing steadily toward her land now, and her garden was proof that her plan was working. Let them talk, she thought. Let them speculate and accuse. When the truth finally came out, and it would, they'd realize they'd picked the wrong person to mess with. Until then, she would keep smiling, keep gardening, and keep proving that sometimes bending the rules of nature and authority could lead to something extraordinary. The confrontation Emma had been dreading and secretly anticipating finally arrived one humid evening. She was crouched near the edge of her property, adjusting a tarp to better guide the creek's flow, when she heard the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. Looking up, she saw Mr. Grayson marching toward her with his usual air of self-importance. His suit jacket was slung over his shoulder, and his tie was loosened, but his expression was as stern as ever. Behind him trailed two other HOA members, their arms crossed and faces set in disapproving scowls. "Emma," Mr. Grayson began without preamble, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to talk." Emma straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her hands onto her jeans. She didn't bother hiding her tools or the trench she'd been working on. It was too late for that now. Instead, she met his gaze calmly, tilting her head slightly as if to say, "Go ahead. Make your move, Mr. Grayson gestured dramatically toward the creek, which was now visibly altered. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" he demanded. "This is community property, Emma. You can't just reroute natural resources for your own benefit." Emma raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Rerouting? Natural resources?" She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Mr. Grayson, this isn't some city pipeline. It's a creek. Last I checked, creeks aren't owned by anyone. They belong to nature." His face reddened at her casual dismissal. "Don't play games with me," he snapped. "You've clearly tampered with the water flow. Look at what's happening to everyone else's yards. The groundwater levels are dropping because of whatever you've done here." Emma folded her arms across her chest, her tone shifting from amused to steely. "Funny you should mention that," she said. "Because last month, when you cut off my water line, nobody seemed too concerned about how I was supposed to keep my garden alive, or even wash my dishes, for that matter. Funny how things change depending on who's affected, isn't it?" The jab hit its mark. One of the other HOA members shifted uncomfortably, while Mr. Grayson's jaw tightened. He recovered quickly, however, pointing a finger at her. That's beside the point. What you're doing is illegal interference with community resources. We're filing a formal complaint, and if necessary, we'll take legal action. Emma smiled faintly, unbothered by the threat. Legal action? Over a creek? Good luck with that. She gestured to the flowing water behind her. Tell me, Mr. Grayson, do you really think a court is going to side with you on this? This isn't a man-made reservoir or a city utility. It's a natural stream that's been here longer than any of us. If anything, maybe you should have thought twice before cutting off my water during a drought. Maybe then I wouldn't have needed to get creative. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Mr. Grayson sputtered, clearly flustered but unsure how to respond. For all his bluster, he knew she had a point. Nature didn't come with rule books or permits, and trying to claim ownership over a wild creek would be a tough argument to win. Still, he wasn't ready to back down completely. This isn't over, he muttered, jabbing his finger in her direction one last time. Mark my words, Emma, you'll regret this. As the trio turned and walked away, Emma watched them go with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. She hadn't expected them to give up so easily, but she also knew they were running out of options. The HOA thrived on control, and nothing rattled them more than someone who refused to play by their rules. By standing her ground, Emma had thrown a wrench into their carefully ordered world, and she wasn't finished yet. Once they were out of sight, she knelt back down to finish securing the tarp. Her hands moved methodically, but her mind raced with possibilities. The HOA might try to fight her, but deep down, she knew they were fighting a losing battle. The creek was hers now, not because she owned it, but because she understood it in a way they never could. And as long as it kept flowing, she'd keep thriving. Let them bring their complaints, their threats, their empty promises of consequences. Emma had already proven one thing beyond doubt. Sometimes, the best way to stand up to bullies was to outsmart them, and let nature do the rest. The HOA's formal complaint sent ripples through the neighborhood, dividing it into two distinct camps. On one side were those who sided with the HOA, convinced that Emma's actions were reckless and selfish. They whispered about how her so-called ingenuity was ruining the community's harmony and blamed her for their dying lawns. On the other side, however, a growing number of neighbors began to admire Emma's boldness. Her lush garden stood as living proof that survival didn't have to mean submission. Not to drought, not to the HOA, and certainly not to fear. Tensions reached a boiling point when inspectors arrived to assess the situation. The HOA had called in local authorities, hoping to shut down Emma's project once and for all. For days, officials poked around her property, examining the creek, the trenches, and the makeshift channels she'd built. Emma watched them closely, her arms crossed, but her expression calm. She answered their questions honestly, explaining that she hadn't dammed or polluted the creek. She'd simply redirected its natural flow. It's still the same water, she pointed out. I'm just borrowing a little more of it than before. To everyone's surprise, including Emma's, the inspectors found no violations. Natural waterways like the creek weren't subject to the same regulations as municipal utilities. As long as Emma wasn't causing harm to wildlife or flooding nearby properties, there was nothing illegal about what she'd done. When the verdict came in, Mr. Grayson was livid. His face turned an alarming shade of red as he sputtered objections, but even he couldn't argue with the law. Defeated, he stormed off, leaving behind a trail of muttered complaints. With the HOA's authority weakened, something remarkable began to happen. People started coming to Emma for advice. Neighbors who had once eyed her suspiciously now knocked on her door, asking how they could replicate her system. Some wanted to know how to dig trenches. Others were curious about rain barrels or irrigation techniques. At first, Emma hesitated. These were the same people who would follow the HOA's rules without question, enforcing conformity at every turn. But then she realized something important. Change often started with necessity. If the drought had taught them anything, it was that relying on old ways of thinking wouldn't save them. Emma decided to help. but on her terms. She organized informal gatherings in her backyard, teaching anyone willing to learn how to work with nature instead of against it. Together, they expanded her original project, creating shared irrigation systems that benefited multiple households. One neighbor contributed spare piping, another offered tools, and soon the entire group was working together under Emma's guidance. Even Mrs. Peterson, who had once accused Emma of hoarding water, pitched in enthusiastically, marveling at how much greener her yard looked after joining the effort. Meanwhile, the HOA struggled to regain control. Their strict rules suddenly seemed outdated and impractical in the face of such widespread collaboration. Faced with mounting pressure from residents who demanded flexibility, they reluctantly loosened some restrictions. Sprinkler bans were lifted temporarily, and permits for small-scale water collection projects became easier to obtain. It wasn't a full victory for Emma, but it was progress, and that was enough for now. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood transformed. Yards that had been brown and brittle began to recover, thanks to the collective efforts of the community. The creek, once ignored by most, became a symbol of resilience and resourcefulness. And Emma, she stood proudly at the center of it all, her hands calloused, but her spirit unbroken. What had started as an act of personal defiance had blossomed into something far greater, a movement toward sustainability, cooperation, and self-reliance. The HOA may have tried to silence her, but in doing so, they had sparked a revolution, one that would shape the neighborhood long after the drought ended. By the time the drought finally broke, the neighborhood was almost unrecognizable. The first heavy rainstorm arrived in the middle of the night, waking Emma with the rhythmic patter of droplets against her window. She stepped outside barefoot, letting the cool water soak into her skin as she looked around at the transformed landscape. Her garden glistened under the moonlight, and the creek, now flowing stronger than ever, babbled happily through its altered course. But it wasn't just her property that had changed. The entire community seemed to breathe easier, united by their shared struggle and newfound resilience. The HOA, once a formidable force, had been humbled by the experience. Their rigid rules no longer carried the same weight they once did. Residents who had blindly followed their directives began questioning decisions and advocating for more practical solutions. When the board proposed reinstating strict lawn care policies after the drought ended, they were met with firm resistance. "We've learned how to adapt," one neighbor said during a heated meeting. "Why go back to doing things the old way when we know better now?" Emma's influence extended beyond just her immediate neighbors. Word of her creative solutions spread to nearby communities, inspiring others to rethink their approach to water conservation. Local newspapers even wrote articles about her, dubbing her the woman who outsmarted the drought. While Emma chuckled at the nickname, she appreciated the recognition, not for herself, but for the message it sent. People needed reminders that sometimes breaking away from tradition could lead to innovation, and that working together often yielded results no rule book ever could. As life returned to normal, Emma found joy in the small victories. Children played near the creek again, laughing as they skipped stones across its surface. Neighbors exchanged tips on sustainable gardening, sharing seeds and cuttings like pieces of a communal puzzle. Even Mr. Grayson softened slightly, though he still avoided eye contact with Emma whenever possible. Once, she caught him inspecting his own wilting bushes and offered him advice on reviving them. To her surprise, he accepted it begrudgingly, muttering a reluctant thanks before hurrying off. It wasn't an apology, but it was progress, and Emma took it as a win. Her own yard remained a testament to perseverance and ingenuity. The vegetables she grew fed not only her but also many of her neighbors, who brought dishes to share in return. Flower beds burst with color, attracting butterflies and bees that buzzed lazily through the air. Every morning, Emma sat on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun rise over her little corner of the world. She felt proud, not because she'd beaten the HOA or survived the drought, but because she'd shown people that they didn't have to wait for permission to make a difference. Looking back, Emma realized the drought had been a turning point. not just for her, but for everyone. It had forced them to confront their vulnerabilities and question long-held assumptions. They had discovered strength in unity, creativity in adversity, and hope in unlikely places. And while the creek eventually returned to its original path, its brief detour had left an indelible mark on the community. One crisp autumn morning, as Emma harvested the last of her pumpkins, a group of neighbors gathered in her backyard to celebrate their collective triumph. There were pies made from her apples, jars of pickles from her cucumbers, and laughter that echoed into the trees. Someone raised a glass in a toast, saying, "To Emma, for reminding us that sometimes bending the rules can change everything." Emma smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. She hadn't set out to be a hero, but in standing up for herself, she'd inspired others to do the same. As the celebration continued around her, she knew one thing for certain. This neighborhood would never be the same again, and neither would she.